I used to tell the stories about my many adventures on the mountain trail. I've not told those stories for a few years now. I've not told any stories for a few years. My hiking stories mostly consisted of funny things or exciting things that happened while I was hiking. You know, some perceived danger that was only real to me but turned out to be funny in the end. And I regaled many people with those stories, especially when I'd be in a group with friends sitting in a bar or at a cookout, just drinking beers and laughing about whatever stories were being told. Everyone loved my stories, but there were a few favorites that people requested. And then this story happened. The story I'm about to share, well, it wiped out all the good stories. It wiped out all the good stories and all the good memories of my times alone in the mountains. It wiped out the good nights of sleep, too. I've not slept a full night in 10 years. Do you know what it feels like to not be able to sleep through a few bad nights of insomnia? Now, take that feeling and multiply it by 10 long years. Add to that the nightmares and the constant fear, as close to insanity as you'll ever get without being completely over the border. So, in my mid-20s, I decided that I wanted to go visit Lost Cove. I'm sure if you know anything about the hiking trails and destinations in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, you've heard of Lost Cove. There are barely any structures left there now. There are 2 graveyards left and some foundations. But 10 years ago, there were a few of the cabins and a huge barn. Heck, there was even still a church still standing. And I wanted to see them before they were gone. In the 1850s, a logging community sprang up on this border mountain. There were no roads leading into Lost Cove. It was the perfect place for moonshiners to brew their highly potent drink, too. The only way in or out was to hike some rather difficult terrain. When the trees had mostly been cleared away, the settlement began to dwindle, and the last family moved out of Lost Cove about 1957, I believe. The place has been abandoned ever since. I kept trying to hook up with a tour that went through Lost Cove, but my work schedule interfered, and after a whole summer of missing out on the tour dates, I decided to go alone. None of my friends were up for the day hike. They all had girlfriends or jobs that distracted them from the adventure. It was autumn when I planned my little adventure. I wouldn't need much as it was only a few hours hike up the mountain. There was always a group of hippies staying at the hostel on the end of Irwin who could give you directions to damn near anything in the woods. And they lived to hike and hike to live, as they like to say. I'd asked directions from them before and was comfortable in doing so again. It was kind of a strange situation, but the 2 men whom I talked to had been adamant about where to exit the railroad tracks and trek off into the woods. You go to the first trestle past Chestoa and immediately exit to the right. Follow that skinny trail a few hundred yards into the woods and it widens out. The trails mark the rest of the way to Lost Cove. No way you can miss it. I thanked them. It was also customary to give them something for their efforts, and in my case, I always gave them a care box. The box contained a couple pair of wool socks, eco-friendly toilet paper, power bars, beef jerky, a canteen, an army surplus jacket, and razors that would probably never be utilized. Most serious hikers would pack these care boxes and have them delivered to what we call outposts along the trail, so that our carry-along bags didn't become overly burdensome. I kept a few at home to have for bargaining purposes, such as asking the hippies at the hostel for good, reliable directions. One of the guys even drew a crude map for me to follow. He also warned me about the trestle. It was dangerously located, extremely high above the Nolichucky River, and saved 4 or 5 hours of hiking the long way around. His parting words to me were, "That trestle is scary as hell, twice as dangerous, and absolutely necessary." Then he shook my hand and we parted ways. At home, I looked over the ink-on-paper map trying to memorize it as best I could, and then slid it into my light pack that I'd planned to take with me the next day. The next morning, I set off, excited to finally be going to Lost Cove. I'd heard so many stories about that cool old place that I couldn't wait to get there and explore it for myself. My pack weighed about 10 pounds, and it had been a while since I'd done a short hike, and liked the much lighter weight of my backpack. I was used to carrying a 60-pound pack and sometimes up to 80 if I had to lug around the tent and other heavy gear. It was a 20-minute drive from my house to the end of Chestawell where I parked. I wasn't really supposed to park where I did. It was only a wide spot on the side of the road that overlooked the rushing river. No one traveled there much, though. Not even the park rangers. I would likely be back before they realized I wasn't down by the river with some of the other people fishing and swimming that day. The trip up the railroad tracks was an easy walk, though it was on a steep incline the whole way. The river grew smaller and smaller as I walked, and by the time I reached the trestle, it looked no bigger than a small backyard stream. It was dizzying. I crossed the trestle quickly and saw the little trail opening my two hippie friends had told me about. I pulled the map from my pack and followed the trail. I saw a few skinny trails that joined the one I was on, and they said nothing about these other trails. I stayed to the one I thought was the main trail and made sure to continue moving up the mountain. About 90 minutes in, I had the feeling that either my hippie friends had given me bad directions, or I'd wandered off the main trail somehow without realizing it. There were no bear sanctuaries on the trail to Lost Cove, so why was I seeing bear sanctuary signs on the trees? It's not a good feeling to see those signs and know that you're alone with no way of protecting yourself. To avoid walking right through the sanctuary, I skirted it, giving the place a wide berth. I didn't want anything to do with any bears. Now, this was about the time where I was pretty sure that I was lost. I continued up the mountain anyway, determined that I would see Lost Cove. I couldn't have gotten that far off the trail. It was a sizable mountain community. I'd walk into it eventually. Only, I didn't. I came to a place that looked so different and so green that I had to stop for a look. Smack in the middle of dense forest was a clear area about 300 square feet, and inside this clearing, everything was covered with soft, super green moss, as if a giant had laid a blanket of moss over this one spot. I was simply amazed. The ground was soft as I walked to what I thought was an oddly shaped outcropping of rocks. I laughed. It was beautiful. Two outcroppings of mossy rocks turned out to be two miniature railroad tracks that came straight out of the ground. The end of the rails had been bent to resemble candy canes. My heart sank. I knew the stories about the old ore mines up here. Those defunct and dangerous mines were nowhere near Lost Cove. I'm talking they're several miles away from it. It also meant that I'd crossed over into North Carolina and was much farther south than I should be. I looked at my compass and it seemed fine, but it had to be screwed up, or I wouldn't have ended up here. It was already 2 p.m, and I'd been walking for 3.5 hours. Dark comes quick to the mountains in autumn. If I turned around and walked back out, it would be dark by the time I reached the car. I'd missed Lost Cove again. But I'd have a good story to tell about finding the old mine opening. I started back the way I'd come. I was upset at not seeing Lost Cove again, but there was always the next weekend. I'd just have to revise my little map and try again. I came back to the bear sanctuary and thought about jogging down the hill through the middle and up the other side to save time, but in the end I skirted it. You can never tell if there's a bear in one of those little dens, or if one will come charging down one of the slopes and trap you there. I wasn't about to risk it. Now I'm certain I used the same path to pass the sanctuary. But 10 minutes past it though, the landscape wasn't the same. Thinking maybe it was just a change in lighting as dusk crept in, I checked my compass again, and again, it seemed fine. But something felt very wrong. The farther I walked, the more I saw that this was not the place I'd come through earlier. The sun was dropping fast, and I had only a small flashlight and no overnight gear. It's easy to get lost on the mountain, but if you follow a downhill route, you're sure to come off the mountain eventually. I walked until I saw a small cave. I didn't have much of a choice. I would try to stay there for the night. The sun was almost gone. What a turn of events today had been. It was the first time I'd ever been lost. These mountains are my home. Hell, I grew up here. The only thing I had to use for cover was a poncho. I settled in against the side wall of the cave. It was just large enough to give a little shelter. In other words, it was uncomfortably small. I couldn't fall asleep, and around midnight, I pulled the poncho on and moved outside the cave to sit until I could finally start hiking again. There is an amazing lack of entertainment in the midnight woods. Sure, there's plenty of time to dwell on things, though. Like how the hell I'd gotten lost in the first place. And that I was going to miss my shift at the AutoZone. My boss would be furious. There was no cell service on the mountain, so I had no way to call and let him know what had happened. And all of a sudden, a gunshot split the night. It wasn't so close that I ducked, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't flinch at the sound. Every night, creatures fell silent. No crickets, no birds, no raccoons scurrying. Nothing but silence and the sound of the wind rattling through the drying early autumn leaves. And another gunshot rang out, closer. Someone screamed. The sound ended abruptly, and then another scream. My mind reeled. Had someone wandered into that bear sanctuary and been attacked? It's almost impossible to tell which direction sounds come from in the mountains, even in the dead silence. I heard no bear, no sounds that signaled any kind of animal attack. The forest went silent again, and a chill crawled over my flesh. The chill had nothing to do with the temperature. It was from the feeling of dread and fear that settled into my center. I wanted to get off the mountain fast, but I still couldn't see well enough to try it. And then, someone or something was running towards me. Labored breathing and uneven, clumsy footfalls signaled the approach. I shot to my feet, looking for a place to get out of sight. I didn't know if I could be seen easily or not, but wanted some distance between me and whoever or whatever was headed my way. I went around the small cave and up an incline that put me above the cave opening and the trail by about a dozen feet, far up enough that I wouldn't be seen from the ground, or so I hoped. And a few seconds later, a man stumbled past my little cave. From my vantage point, I could see he was terrified, and the black splatters and smudges across his clothes and his face, well, I could tell that they were blood. I clamped my mouth shut and gripped the ground I lay on. Human nature dictated that I tried to help this man. However, survival instinct forced me to lie still and assess the situation better before I tried to help. As I watched, the man fell directly below me, babbling incoherently and scrambling to gain his feet again. But before he could, though, I heard another sound. It was a stealthier movement, quicker and lighter on the forest floor. Something was coming for that poor man, and it was coming fast. I wanted to tell him to shut up, be quiet, and hide in the cave. But I didn't. In the small clearing below me, a figure appeared. It moved swift as the wind, its long dreadlocks flapping out behind it, and then falling lankily against its skinny form. It looked human. Small, skinny, as if maybe it were a child. The elongated arms weren't right, though. The way the thing moved towards the man wasn't quite right for a human either. The man gained his feet and almost immediately tripped and fell again. The thing raised one of those two long arms, and I saw that it wielded a machete-type blade. There was a tiny silvery glint as the blade arced downward, catching a shaft of moonlight. And then, all of a sudden, the man's babbling stopped, and there was a sickening thud as his head hit the dirt. I was too terrified to scream. I'd just witnessed a murder that I might have been able to prevent had I not been such a chicken shit. The thing stepped over to the decapitated body, toed the shoulder, laughed, and reached for the head. Carrying the head by its hair, the thing moved back towards the trees and then stopped to pick up something else. The head swiveled, and I saw the face. The open mouth, wide eyes, and the sheer terror of the expression made me recoil. And the almost human creature stuffed that head into a sack, and that sack had at least two other head-sized bulges that I could see. The creature laughed maniacally again and walked into the woods, leaving me in a state of fear-induced paralysis for the next half hour. And when I was able, I took to my feet, avoiding looking down at the headless body, and I ran. I ran blindly until dawn, and I'd reached the river finally. Crossing took another 20 minutes. I didn't bother trying to make it back up to Chestewa to find my car. I headed down the paved road and towards the police station, which was closer than my car would be anyway. Now I know the sheriff personally, and was glad to see him when I stumbled in wet from the river crossing and cold from the chilly morning air. He tried to calm me as I blurted out what I'd seen. And at the end of my story, he handed me a cup of hot, strong coffee. Listen, son, I hear what you're saying, but I don't believe it. Monsters don't live in the mountains. Certainly not head-hunting monsters. Now, I want you to rest up and tell me again that story later today after you've slept a bit. But I know what I saw. Why would I lie to you? I set the coffee down, sloshing it onto his desk. You know there have been unsolved murders in the region over the past months, right? I nodded. Of course I knew. Everyone did in the small community. The heads were missing in at least 5 of those murders. Now I won't have you telling your wild story and inciting panic in the community. Now what he really meant was that no matter how much I slept, if my story didn't change, he wasn't going to even consider it. And he didn't.